Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We've got another extra sailor in the back. So a number of people have given these presentations over the course of the last couple of years, and I sat and read Jamie's, who had previously done it, and I thought, actually, what I've got to do is avoid saying the obvious. I've got to try to come up with something which is a little bit more specific to my knowledge. And Peter and I were just chatting in the bar next door about what you learn in a boat race, and it really drove home the point that I was thinking about when I typed this up earlier today, which is you aren't trying to win the boat race, you're trying to avoid losing it. Because he and I sail as much or more than most people in the yacht club, and we were just chatting next door about what's the right way to do this at Laurence, what's the right way to do that in the harbour. We didn't talk about the harbour, we could have had the same conversation. Actually, nobody knows. The point about this conversation is to come up with strategy that most of the time will work, accepting the fact that it never works all the time. So the whole objective is not to try to win the race, it's to try to avoid losing it. Every time you try to win the race, I think, personally for me anyway, but I think you do worse trying to win things than trying to avoid losing them. Because no one has any bloody idea what's going to happen. Every single race we've ever done has been different. If you can put your hand up and say, I sailed 2 races that were really identical to each other, I'd be amazed. Really amazed. Because they are never the same. You've no idea what's going to happen in 5 minutes' time. So the whole objective of strategy is to come up with a strategy where you aren't going to lose the race. So, in the harbour, this isn't on PowerPoint, you'll have to excuse the... In the harbour, I define the 4 key wind directions being north, cold, northerly, blows over the mountains. Northeast, out at sea, it's definitely more right than coming over the mountains. East, when it's blowing straight down the harbour, you've got that nice, relatively straight breeze down the harbour. And westerly, virtually every other breeze doesn't exist in the harbour. These 4 are what I think, when I go out, okay, which direction is the wind, and how is the strategy going to be affected by north, northeast, east, or west? West, we're not going to talk about too much because, to be honest, westerly is pretty random. It's usually 2 sea breezes. If you've got a westerly, it'll be a sea breeze blowing to about Hung Hom, and then it'll be a easterly blowing in the other side, and in the middle, never the twain shall meet. But we'll talk about westerly, but not so much. So, northerly. This is that day when a cold northerly blows over from the old Kai Tak airport, and for me that's just a straight go left breeze. If it genuinely is a northerly, it's genuinely coming out of Kowloon Bay, and there's not really any right in it, it's not coming down the harbour at all. You look at the puffs and they're just rolling over those hills, blowing down onto the racecourse. For me, that's definitely just go left. If you fall off the edge of the breeze, it's almost always bad. There's me. I'm going to draw a picture now. So strategically, in that situation, I would always go left. You know what happens? The wind comes down off the mountain, it blows onto the race course, and as it hits the water, it starts to dissipate. So the people further right, again I need a pen, wait for the pen, but the people further right, people more towards this island shore instead of over by the Kowloon shore, always have less wind. And the guys to the left always have a lift. They just arc up, aiming up at the airport, the old airport somewhere. You're down here, you're headed, you've got less pressure. Peter Backey's an expert at getting into the left-hand corner. Gets a lefty, gets lifted, sails off into the distance. If you genuinely have a northerly, and you've really got to figure out what's a northerly, good man, thanks.
How often do we get northerlies? It doesn't seem very often.
Well, more than we would like, for sure. I mean, if the forecast is a new front coming down, if the forecast is a northerly, if it's colder, and if it's coming more to the left, I mean, how many have we had this year? We had the opening regatta,
Yeah,
we had a northerly, such that you had to start on port tack actually. What was Lipton Trophy? That was a bit more to the right, wasn't it? That was a northeasterly. So that's that's the start line, as it often is. That's the old airport. If the breeze is here, invariably starting towards this end of the line and keeping to the left if the marks are up here. How many Impala sails have we got here? Because you guys often do different courses to us, right? The Etchells tend to go up to Shocky 1 up here, whereas I think a lot of the Impalas and Ruffians tend to go to Taikushing. Yeah. In that situation in particular, getting up by the old airport somewhere, you will get the best pressure, you'll get the best wind. By the time it gets down here, it's dissipated, it's feeble, it doesn't happen. And it's more headed. So these people end up doing this in a headed wind, whereas these people end up with the best pressure arcing over. So if it's north, for me, it's very simple. Go left.
Does the current change your calculus at all?
We're going to get to tide in a minute. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I actually don't. If anyone can answer this question, I'd love to know. What happens in the tide in that square there? I'm not sure I have any real idea. But no, if it's a northerly, you'll have more pressure and lifted on the left, so I would go left.
Do you mind referring to, we got the green and the red mark right halfway up the B.
Yeah.
So you're saying going left, so would you say it's north of the green marker?
Definitely. Definitely, yeah. I'll make this a bit bigger scale. If that's the start line, that's the tall buildings by Hung Hom, and that's the old airport here. Taikushing's here somewhere, maybe a little more over there. You've got the red one and the green one. I think you've got to be inside that all the time in a northerly. You'll have big shifts. You know, the shift will be, the wind will be moving between, I don't know, probably 30 degrees from left to right, but all the time you'll have more pressure that side of the line.
The new Kai building, the cruise terminal.
Yeah.
Do you think that affects the distance you go close to land, so you think?
So far, I don't think so. No. I think in light air, we'll get to light air in a minute from a different direction, because normally you don't have much light air northerly. If it's northerly, it'll be a new front pumping in. So generally, a northerly will be a windier race, at least with decent strength gusts. In a minute, we'll get to what happens in a light air northeasterly breeze. And my experience so far is that being under here is not a problem in terms of wind. Okay, so that's number one of the wind conditions. If it's in the north, go left. Northeasterly. This is the hardest one. So, old runway. Island shore with the North Point ferries. Start line. This really is the hardest one. So the breeze is not in this direction. It's not a pure northerly. It's not blowing through that hole in the mountains. You've got a bloody great mountain here, and you've got bloody great mountains here. A northerly blows through there. It's always left. A northeasterly is not much different. Blows from here somewhere. But you end up with a situation where it's flicking, sometimes between that gap in the mountains, and sometimes this side of the mountains. When it blows this side of the mountains, it drags the wind round to here. So out at sea, it's in that direction, pure northeasterly. In this left-hand corner, you can get some left-hand shift, which means going in here is nice. But out here, you definitely get much more east in the breeze. And this leads to a really transitional race. I think it's the hardest race in the harbour, because you will find people doing really well on this side of the race course at the beginning. really well. They'll be lifted, you'll be here, you come off the start line, you do your tacks, you'll be here, heading over, and they'll be lifted up much more aggressively than you. Well, maybe not that far, that's a bit extreme, but you know, they'll be 10 degrees up on you, sailing higher, sailing faster. The problem is that when you get over to this breeze, you've got a 30-degree wind shift, and you've got to be to the right. So you need to avoid the temptation of pinching up into this corner. And I think this is something that the boats that are going to Taikoo Shing sometimes get stuck into this mode of pinching too hard, going too slow, aiming to the left. In the Etchels, because we tend to go to Shokiwan more, we're much more, okay, I need to think about long-term getting into this header. I need to lead the fleet into this direction, because when we get this shift, that will happen. This person here will end up headed into this wind shift. Peter and I and 3 or 4 others had a really good Etchel race recently. I think it was a Lipton Trophy. Did you Lipton Trophy? No, okay. It was Frank. We had a great race. Well, we came off the start line and we were all battling because the wind was in this direction. So Mark Thornborough started here, we started in the middle somewhere, Frank Van Kempen. We all yachted off, and Mark definitely lifted up, and he looked absolutely fantastic. We said, don't go with him. Long term, this header is going to come in. We'll do the opposite. We'll go fast as we can in this direction. And Jamie McWilliam actually started down here and tacked immediately, so he was bow forward, even further forward. He was doing the same thing. And we had a great race where this looked great. He was doing so well, really well. Eventually, when the header came, his course turned round to here, and he found that we were already down here. We then all tacked over, and Mark was really in a lot of trouble. That wind shift, which had looked good, disappeared. We all looked a lot better over here. And then you had the battle of, when do you try to swap from being, in my case, I was about the 3rd or 4th boat to the left. When do you swap from being this side of the fleet to being this side of the fleet? Because at some point you've got to take a loss. You've got to say to yourself, okay, these people are ahead of me because they got into this wind shift first. When do I take their transom, go behind them, and try to use this wind shift in the long term to get onto the lifted tack? And it was a really interesting spot on the E2, E1 green and red marks. Just after that is when I think this breeze starts to take over from this one. So as you approach this line of sight between the runway and the red one and the green one, you want to think about the course in 2 different halves. That's one half of the course, and that's a different half of the course. And they are completely different race courses. What works at this point won't work at this point. And figuring out when you swap strategy from looking for these left-hand gusts into looking for the right-hand wind shift, even if there's a little bit less wind, is a really, really key thing. We had an actual race, RNVR, last year. In fact, you definitely did that, Peter. The RNVR went out through Lai Yamun. We ended up coming back under the headland. It was exactly the same situation. Down here, it paid to be left. Further up, the wind was even more right. And at some point, you had to give up this side and take the pain of getting into this header so that you could lift out the other side. And when you did that, it was super critical. And it seems to be roughly through that line. Does that make sense? Swapping from that breeze to that breeze. Because it's really easy to get in your head, okay, I'm doing well, I look really good, I'm winning the boat race, I'm on the left-hand side, I've got this wind shift. You're ahead of everybody, you're 2nd or 3rd or 1st, whatever it happens to be. The problem for you, if you're in this position, is the mark is not here. The mark is either here if you're if you're an Impala or a Ruffian, or it's even over here if you're an Etchel. This is the final shift. This is the one that you need to be positioning for long term. All this does is get you off the start line and halfway up the beat. But the race doesn't end halfway up the beat. The race ends up here. So the last shift is much, much more important than the first shift.
So what's the difference between when somebody's attack right after the start line, just getting to the shore, to catch the second breeze one?
Yeah, okay, well, we'll come to that one in a moment. This is when you've got the two shifts between northeast and north. And in a minute, what we'll do now is we'll do what happens when you get more of an easterly. Because in that scenario, which I've just rubbed out, you don't really get to the North Point ferries very much. It's pretty hard with a northerly, any sort of northerly, to consider a strategy which says I'll come over here to North Point too early. It's too much of a loss because they have too much northeast breeze to get over the top of you. Okay? However, when you get a bit more easterly, I've called it easterly, it's not really a pure easterly, but when you have a bit more easterly, same situation, here's Hung Hom, here's the old airport, here's the start line. When the breeze is in this direction, let's call it east for a change, you are very much thinking about the opportunity to do the long port tack in towards the North Point ferries. And this is where the tide becomes, who was asking about tide? This is where the tide becomes much more important. Anytime the breeze is in north or northeasterly, I'm not sure the tide makes that much difference because the majority of the tide is running down that channel there. That's the wall. That channel there is where the most of the tide is. In that scenario, in that situation, tide is a big deal. So if the mark is here and you're doing your course over there, personally I don't know what the tide does in here. So honestly, I ignore it. I suspect that there is very little tidal relief unless you get into that portion there. I think when you're sailing off on starboard in light wind and you're heading this way, in an easterly for instance, you've got to get really close to the airport before you see a tidal gain. You do start to see it as you head this way, but you don't really see a big situation where you're on starboard, the fleet is lined up behind you, hopefully behind you. You don't really see a tidal gain until you get into this sort of zone here, is my experience. You do see people, when they get to this point, all of a sudden, the tide which is sweeping you down dissipates on the leader as he gets into here, and all of a sudden, from being stacked up with boats on the hip like that, this one suddenly effectively goes forward, and these ones fall down because they're in more tide for longer. They fall in line with the leader.
How wide is that tide-free zone, do you think? Because isn't there an exclusion zone?
There are sometimes exclusion zones here, I think.
Oh, I thought...
Is there one along the front?
It's
Yes.
new, it's new.
Is it? I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, so I don't know what distance you're talking about.
I think here you're talking about no more than 120 metres, 100 metres. You've got to be within 100 metres of the old airport to get out of the tide. If that's 300 metres, if your boat is 300 metres from here to here, I don't think you've got any less tide there than this guy's got here, personally.
Well, I always get the green mark.
Green mark, so you're happy as long as you're inside the green, left of the green mark, you're happy. Okay, well that...
Which is a lot bigger.
It's a lot bigger, yeah, and the green mark is out here, it's got to be 500 metres out. Personally, I don't think you get any gain whether you're 100 metres inside the green one or 100 metres outside the green one. The only gain you get is when you're within 150 metres of that shore. Then you definitely don't have as much tide. These people are being swept this way, and you here have got relatively less current, and they will start to fall down onto your line.
So in the northeasterly, all things being equal, you would aim to almost lay that green buoy
I personally would want to be well to the left of the green buoy.
in the northeast.
In a northeasterly, yeah. Yeah. If I was in no man's land, which is somewhere between the green buoy and the red buoy, I would feel that I was getting the worst of both worlds.
Right.
In a minute we'll come to the wind shift.
Well, yeah.
There's a wind shift gain to the right, which we'll
Yeah.
get to, and there's a tidal gain to the left. I'm not sure that any point at all in that situation. Seems to me you're going to lose to the people to the left and to the people to the right. One of the things about the strategy here is you've got to pick a side. In a minute we'll talk about Llama. You do not pick a side at Llama. In the harbour, to a degree, you've got to pick a side. The difference between being a boat here and a boat here is enormous. I mean, it's such a huge distance. I don't know how far that is. Anyone want to hazard a guess? It's got to be down nearly a kilometre, hasn't it? 800 metres? It's a hell of a long way. So what that person is doing there, forget about them. If you've decided your strategy is to go left, we'll talk about when you should go left and right, but if you've decided your strategy is to go left, you cannot deal with this guy at all. He's either ahead of you or he's behind you. But there's nothing you can do about it. So I'm not sure there's any point in being in here particularly. If you decide the strategy is to go left, then bloody go left and get in there. If you think the strategy is to go right, we'll talk about when left and right, then go right. But I would try to avoid being in there. If I was tacking up this shore and I found myself near these two buoys, I would say, okay, I'm this side of the, that's the red one, isn't it? If I was this side of the red one, I would stay here, get closer to the shore. And if I was that side of the other one, I would get closer to that shore.
When do you just go sail for it? Like you see breeze and you sail for breeze and you kind of...
If you can see a decent puff and you're 100% certain that it's there and you can get to it and use it, then you should probably do so. Partly depending on how good you can tack, what boat you're in, whether it tacks smoothly or loses. If you're in a ruffian, you need a much bigger gain to do two tacks for it compared to an estual, as an example. But you've got to be really sure that the gain is there. Otherwise, you're sacrificing strategy with a short-term tactic. And in the harbour, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. Most times, you'll find somebody from here wins, or somebody from here wins. And I said earlier, don't try to win the race, just try to avoid losing it. But you've got to win your side. Okay? If you've decided that you want to go left, you pretty much have to win the 6 boats that come out of that side. Because if your 6 are correct, you're winning the race. If your 6 are incorrect, you're only halfway down the fleet. The problem is, if you lose your side and it's the wrong side, you're last. Which is really a disaster, because you can get to the windward mark, you don't have to be winning, but you need to be in the game. So you need to win your side. So if you've got 6 boats down here, you probably want to be more left of them, beat them, even if these people beat you.
If you get a lot of tide against, and you start at Hum and you go to Takashin, you say? No, to TKS.
Yeah, Takashin.
Yeah. Would you ever think it'd be worth it to cross the harbour?
Well, you've got to cross the harbour at some time, so you.
No. If the upwind mark is on the left and start is on the left, so you have to cross it twice, right?
Well,
Well, I've seen it.
Tide is a really good one, and particularly on the day when you've got double highs. When you look at the tidal chart and it goes up, comes down a tiny bit and goes back up again on a double high, you can have a lot of tide. And in the estuals, if the tide is ebbing, going out that way, I reckon that being first into the North Point ferries, I reckon that's worth 4 boat lengths in tidal effect between starting here and tacking and starting here and tacking. So usually there's a little bit of pin bias. Usually you look at the start line and you think, okay, I'll start towards the pin end at the start. That's just how it gets set up mostly. There are a couple of Etchells who would completely ignore that. Nick Burns is one of them. And he starts here, and he gets a lousy bloody start, and he comes over the start line and he tacks. And we come over, we win the start, or we do a nice start, and we tack, and we're here. So we're 4 boat lengths ahead of him. Looks great. But the tide is absolutely ripping out down that channel that we talked about before. And because he's a little bit further bow forward on you, he gets into it first. And it's amazing to watch how this tidal effect, which here is this much, here is this much, here is this much, by the time you get to here, it's that much. His course sweeps him up to your course. So your 4 boat length gain off the start line is completely and utterly gone by the time you get to the North Point ferries. So in an ebb, I think you need a damn good reason not to be pushing this side really hard. Really hard.
The only problem tends to be as you come into that right-hand side, you lose pressure.
You do lose a bit of pressure under here, for sure. There is a little bit less wind, particularly in this triangle. If your course allows you to get towards this end of the North Point ferries, I think the hole is less significant. But if you are downwind of these ferry piers, the hole here is pretty miserable. But more and more I'm starting further up the line and tacking quicker to try to get into this tidal gain in an ebb when the tide's going out. Because I think that gain is pretty big. Conversely, when the tide's flooding the other way, again this gets back to my I'm not quite sure what's happening here thing, but the tide is definitely hoofing in there, and anything between those 2 buoys, Peter's buoys, is a nightmare. You definitely do not want to be in a flood when the tide's coming in. You do not want to be in that region. In that scenario, the opposite happens. As you get into the tide first, you slip off, then you fall into that zone of no wind that Andy's talking about, and it's a disaster area. You seriously need to be thinking about using this opportunity in here to get out of the tide. Or you need to come up this wall. The problem with that wall is that the depth difference between the wall and 30 metres off is nothing. There's virtually no depth difference. So the tide is ripping down this wall at down nearly the same speed on it as 50 metres out or 30 or 100 metres out. You've got to be down nearly touching that wall to get a tidal relief. You do see it the other way around. We had a race last year, the RMVR, which I was talking about with Peter a minute ago. We had a race last year in the RMVR where we came in through La Yamoon Gap from wherever we've been out there, Sheko somewhere, and the wall is, you've got your various bits here, Chai Wan, then the wall is here. And the tide was ripping out. Tide's that way. And we were fighting each other, so we both ended up here, trying to keep out of the tide. There was no wind. We swapped to this side. Peter didn't, stayed over here. And we both lost 5 or 6 places, 6 or 7 places. We both went from first and second to nowhere. The difference was that these people had come and they'd hugged this shore. When they got into the harbour, they started to drift offshore a bit. They gained everything by keeping out of the tide at La Yamoon Gap. But then they drifted offshore, not by very far, probably only by 70 metres. We came round, did a couple of jibes, got ourselves back in the race, and honest to God, we were within 4 metres of that wall, all the way down the edge. The boom was nearly touching the wall. And the difference between there, literally 5 metres, and here, 50 metres, was enormous. we were just able to slowly sail past people on the wall, and they were here, heading down here, and they just never came in with us. And bit by bit, we just hugged the wall, hugged the wall. Then there was an obstruction, so we had to deviate outside the obstruction, shot past the boys. As soon as we could, we jived back in. We were going to a buoy over here, dock buoy, and we hugged all the way down to the ferry piers, all the time out of the tide, and then we finally did our jive over. So if you can get close enough to the wall, there is a tidal relief from a negative tide, but it literally is about 5 metres. So if you're doing it the other way and you're coming up, you've got to tack. You can't tack every 5 metres. That's a 50-metre length. Oops, you're back in the tide. Nightmare. You get out of the tide for a little bit, you've got to tack back again. So tacking up against the tide, I'm not sure the wall works anymore. Once upon a time, I was one of those people who used to like to get underneath the flyover up there, so the mast was under the flyover. You felt like you were out of the tide. But I think you can slightly forget about getting out of the tide against the wall. The other big factor in a more easterly breeze is the last late lefty. It applies more if you're going to Shokiwan than Taikushing. That's the start. That's from Hong, Old Airport. Etchels tend to go to Shokiwan. More like that. There is undoubtedly a last lefty. So we will definitely fight our way up the beat, not too fussed about where we go. Then we think there's a gain to the right here. The wind bends around the harbour, so it tends to favour the right-hand side, except for these puffs that come out of, what would that be, Kowloon Bay, right? Over in Kowloon Bay, you will get lefties. So we're quite happy to be on the right as we go up the beat, but right at the top, you can sometimes get a header, and people will come in from the left-hand side in the last left lefty. Last late lefty. All of which points to, you can have a strategy, but you can't have fixed tactics. Before you start, make a decision whether you think the breeze is north, northeast, or east. Choose, I'm going to go left, I'm going to go middle, or I'm going to go right, based on that. But then don't base everything, all of your tactics, only on that strategy. Your strategy is your big picture, that's what I want to do. But tactically, you've got to somehow get to where you want to be. Yeah? Jamie McWilliam has a number for this. I'm not a big believer in this because I think the harbour is a bit too random. But Jamie's got a number which he gave in this conversation a couple of years ago. If that's the start line and you're sailing on starboard, if your heading is above 65 degrees in an ebb tide, if the tide's going that way, and your heading's above 65 degrees, he thinks you should go right. Okay, because what he's saying is that the wind shift over here is not big enough to offset. The wind is already far enough right here that you won't get enough right-hand shift to win. So he's actually got it down to a number. I'm not convinced. I think that the wind is too variable and there's too many shifts and too many holes and blah, blah, blah. But his number is 65 on an ebb tide and 75 on a flood tide. So you could bring it all the way down to numbers. You could literally line up on starboard, have a look at the heading that you're making. Even if those numbers are not 100% right, it is worth having a data log and keeping that number written down somewhere. Every time you go out, write down on starboard before the start, I was heading 65. Left paid or right paid. I was heading 85 before the start. Which side paid? And Jamie is a very mathematical brain. He's very focused on a number equals a result. And I think sometimes, I know I'm guilty of it, but I think we all are, sometimes we all think intuition, skill and ability will enable us to win the race. Putting some numbers to it is a damn good way of trying to eliminate some of that guesswork. Any questions so far?
Can I ask you about the last bit of
Yep.
the shake one? Quite often, if you're beating up to shake one,
Yeah.
boats will hug the shore after the piers,
Yeah.
and then you'll see the water close to the shore towards shake one. Often there's breeze there, it's
Yeah.
flatter water, and it's very tempting to go in there,
Yeah, in here.
and you feel as if you're going really well, but then you'll see people further out,
Yeah.
will suddenly get much better pressure and will just climb up
Yeah.
around ahead of you. I don't know why that happens.
I think because the tidal relief on this wall is minuscule, and there are some puffs that come out of Kowloon Bay. The other shore is over here somewhere. There are some puffs that come out of Kowloon Bay, and some of those puffs filter over just far enough that this ley line, those are the two ley lines, port and starboard, you think you can see a puff in here somewhere. You think, oh, it doesn't look too bad, I'll keep going. But what happens is these people, Mark Thornborough did it to me a couple of weeks ago, we were both sailing in on starboard. I was here, he was here. No problem at all. We were winning, we had him covered. And it looked like there was decent breeze here. And he tacked off, and we had a bait on our boat. Should we tack on him, give him some dirty air, just keep with him? And we looked at it, we said, oh no, there's plenty of wind here, it'll be fine. It was about, this distance here was about, I don't know, 120 metres, 150 metres. So just enough room for two tacks, but not really. A tack costs distance, why do two tacks if you can do one? So we let him go. And it was an exact case like that. You couldn't see any reason not to go to this wall, but one of these little puffs rolled in, and by the time he got to here, he was lifted up to that point, and although we continued to sail our existing angle, it was a bit lower than him, with a little bit less pressure, and he gained, I don't know, 2 or 3 boat lengths, not enough to overtake us. From being comfortably in front of him, all of a sudden he was right with us. It's these lefties that come down, and they dissipate in that sort of area. Just if you're not on this ley line, you're just the wrong side of it, and you just don't get quite the same pressure. Hong Kong Harbour is so difficult because you will find those puffs come down and don't get all the way to the next boat. It applies in the northerly too. When the breeze is out of the north over here, as we said earlier, you start, these people always have more wind than these people. And the damn puffs hit them, and they never quite get down here. So in a northerly, you can't wait for the breeze to get to you. It is not going to come. It's going to help them, and then it's going to dissipate, and you won't get it.
If there are cruise liners parked, is it worth taking the pain and taking a slightly long way round to go upwind of the cruise liners? Is the wind that much better the other side of them?
I think the tide is considerably different left to right. So I'm not sure that there's always a huge difference in the wind, but I do think that is one where the tide is a lot better, a lot less negative inside the ships. So if that's the old runway, you quite often get that sort of gold ship that's here somewhere. Where's Taikoo Shing relative to that? Is that this side of it? Yeah. So you're making that decision, do I come up here or do I take the pain and do that? I think if the tide is coming in, this works very well. I wouldn't worry about a bit of a hole here. Partly depends. If you're in a flying 15, that hole is a lot worse than if you're in an actual. In an actual, you'll blast through it. In a 15, you can lose quite a lot of time there. So it depends on which boat you're sailing. But I do think with the tide against you, hugging in towards this shore, is a lot better than fighting your way to the right of that ship. But again, it depends whether the wind is, which wind are you talking about? Are you talking about an easterly or a northerly?
No, north or east,
A northeast, east.
Northeast or east, northeast.
Yeah, yeah. But I think going inside the ships can be good. We've had quite a few actual races where people go well past what you think the ley line is, inside that great ship. That wasn't a very good ship, was it? Inside that ship, and you think they've overstood the mark, but they still come out smelling of roses. You beat your way up here, and you think, okay, I've definitely sailed the more direct line, but because they've got less tide, they do well.
Laurence, with this last late lefty, is there some consideration given to, I guess, if you're 1 and 2 and you're clear of the pack, then it doesn't matter if you go for that, but if you're maybe in 4th or 5th and people are queuing up to get on the port ley line, are you better off just sucking it up and going for that and joining them on the ley line, or thinking about going the lefty when there's a chance that you may have to duck 3 or 4 boats on the buoy?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. What you're talking about here is, this is a ley line, and that's a ley line, and there are a bunch of boats here coming in, is what you're saying?
Yeah, or vice versa, or you're almost going to be committed to that ley line. So you need to be cognizant of the fact that, are you going to go back to that last late lefty, which might mean that you have to duck 3 or 4 boats on?
Yeah. Do you fight out here hoping to get a lefty?
Yeah.
But the downside is, if you don't get a lefty, you end up having to duck all that lot.
Or even if you do get it, you might have to duck them as well.
Yeah, I've learnt to hate the port ley line in the last year. Each time I get out there, I end up having to duck a whole bunch of boats.
Yeah.
And it's miserable. So I'm currently in a hate the port ley line phase. I'd rather be down here on starboard relatively earlier. But
so if you're 1 and 2 and you're clear of the rest of the fleet, think about doing it. If you're in the bunch, then maybe it's a more risky strategy to go and try and hit that last late lefty.
I think that's correct, yeah. I think if you're in the bunch, I think you want to try and avoid being on the port ley line if there's a bunch of boats there. Conversely, if everyone's fighting for this corner and you can get a bit of clean air over here, personally, I'd gamble.
Yeah.
I'd get over there, I'd hope for a late last lefty. I'd hope that it meant I could cross a bunch of boats
and squeeze in.
Yeah. I mean, the rule only applies within 3 boat lengths. So as long as you're coming in, now this is a classic Hong Kong. As long as you're coming in below 3 boat lengths, you're allowed to tack. The problem is that the last late lefty only applies on that ley line. If you are down here, playing it safe so you can tack before the 3 boat length circle, you almost certainly won't get that lefty. You have to really gamble, be over there, get it, and gain, or not. But just going halfway to it from this ley line, if you're coming in here and you say, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll go halfway, that won't work. If you're going to do it, you've got to damn well do it. Get over there and hope.
It's well worth knowing your rules at the top mark.
So you either need to be clear or you're ducking.
Yeah. And if you've got to duck, just duck.
Yeah.
You know, there's this big thing about, I'm going to put the helm over and tack. You're coming into the windward mark. You need to be 100% certain you're going to pull it off, or don't try. What's the worst case scenario? That's the mark. That's 3 boat lengths. If you're coming in here and it turns out that there are too many boats and you've got to duck behind them, you duck, you've got loads of speed, you tack, you put the spinnaker up. You do lose boats, but you don't lose that much. It's not the end of the world. Whereas coming in here, having to do a 720 with no spinnaker, etc., is a lot of loss.
I think you're going to read your angles coming in as well. 100 meters down the line. If you're coming in on port, you think about tacking out for the ley line. If you're on a lift, there's no point in tacking out.
Yeah.
But if you're on a big header, you've got all the chance in the world to get something.
Yeah, I mean, that is correct. A lot depends on what your angle is as you're coming in here on port. If you are lifted up, these guys are going to be headed off, as a consequence of your wind shift, you've got a half decent chance of pulling it off. You can be a bit, put the Stetson hat on, be a cowboy and go for it.
Yeah.
Conversely, if you are seeing yourself suffer, you're headed, these people are lifted up, you just have to take the Stetson off, stop being a cowboy and go for it. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about a westerly, because it is virtually the only other direction. We only have north, northeast, east and west. We never have this, virtually never. We virtually never have this. Southerlies, and we just don't get them. There's just too many mountains, too many...
Sunset series.
No, sunset series. I'm not doing strategy for the sunset series. I'm leaving now. But we do get a westerly, and if we do, that's when you have that awful situation where the westerly will get, that's Hung Hom, that's the old airport. We have that terrible situation where the westerly will get to about that, and the easterly will get to about that. And in the middle, Lord knows. As a general rule, the narrowest gap between the two breezes, if there's no breeze in the middle and there is a breeze blowing here and a breeze blowing here, the narrowest gap is by the North Point ferries, generally. So if you're coming down this way in the old breeze, if this mark is set a little bit more this way, I don't know about Peter, but my preference is to come all the way down this shore, down nearly touch the ferries, somehow or another try and squeeze through this gap, even if I then have to do a 90-degree turn to get to that mark. I think that going over this way, it can always work. Anything can work in a westerly in Hong Kong Harbour, but it's a much higher risk. If someone pulls it off, great, they're lucky, but the chance of being abandoned by the wind over here is much higher than over here. So if you've got two competing winds, my own view is that the narrowest gap is there. And broadly speaking, the further this way you can be to the island shore, the better.
And that applies when you're running at the start. You drop off to the right.
Correct. If you're running this way with spinnakers up,
Yeah.
my own preference would be to heat it up into this corner here and hope to transition into this breeze over here. Because if you try and go straight, the gap between the two winds, I think, is considerably bigger. We get that in closing regatta quite a lot, is what you're referring to, isn't it?
Yeah.
We start down here and we've got to try and spinnaker, or we start at the club actually, round Hung Hom, and then we've got to try and get up to here somewhere. My general rule of thumb is, if that's the course they give us, to get to Hung Hom and then to push down hard towards the island shore. Okay, I'm going to speed it up a little bit. General harbour rule, tack on the headers fast. I just started sailing with a new tactician who's new to Hong Kong, and when he first came to Hong Kong, we got a header, and I'd say, you want to take this header? He'd say, well, let's wait a bit, 30-second rule, let's wait and see if it stays this way. Forget it. If the jib starts to flap, if it starts to back, put the damn helm over, tack the boat. Reason? It won't be the same in 20 seconds' time. In a minute we're going to talk about Lama. In Lama it's the opposite. In Lama it definitely is wait 30 seconds and see what happens, see if the breeze is going to stay headed, then you tack. But Guy, who now sails with me, every time the jib starts to go back a little bit, he says tack, tack, tack. So in the harbour, tack fast on headers. They're short, they're sharp, you haven't got time to sail into them, you haven't got time to work out what's going on. I wanted to just talk a little bit about lead back to the headers. Who is comfortable with the idea that headers win races, not lifts? Okay? If this is a race course, I'll stick with the harbour thing. That's the middle of the race course. Lifts, what we were told when we were children, lifts are what win races. Actually, it's headers that win races. Because if you're lifted, okay, you started at this course, then the wind shifts and you're lifted up to this course, you think you're heading closer to the mark. The problem is you're actually going away from the mark, because you're getting further away from the middle. If you're lifted again, I mean obviously if you're lifted all the way to the mark, great, but that's not going to happen normally. If you're lifted, you're all the time heading away from the mark. you're heading away from the middle of the race course. Where you want to be is the middle. So actually you're not looking for lifts, you should be looking for headers. Because every header that you get allows you to tack and head back on a lift to the middle. And the middle is the place you've got to learn to love. The reason is the windward mark is in the middle, should be in the middle. The windward mark is in the middle of the race course. So a header is much more valuable to you than a lift. If you're on a lift, you're waiting for it to go away. Please go away, please go away. I need to tack and get back to the middle. Okay? So when you have a race course like that, and a whole bunch of boats head off in this direction, when they come back in this direction, you need a damn good reason, if this is you coming in here, you need a damn good reason to go to there. Lead back to the header. Tack here and lead back to the middle. The wind will head at some point, you tack back to the middle again. Leading back to the headers, being this boat and not being this boat, or even being this boat. These three boats are all even with each other, okay? Effectively, they're all bow to bow. They're all equal. I'd much rather be this one than this one every single time. You want to be leading back to the middle. Lead back to the header. It's a really, really big thing. Letting somebody cross ahead of you, being this boat here, and allowing this one to cross to the middle while you end up over on this side of him, you really, really need a good reason to be that boat. Anytime a boat's crossing ahead of you, you seriously need to ask the question, do I want that boat to cross me? And you do sometimes, but rarely the answer is yes, I'll let him cross me. Most times, tack. Get your boat heading back to the middle before him. In a minute we're going to come to Llama with a really good example of it. Okay? Lead back to the headers. It's a super important concept. We've talked about tide. We talked about the 4 lengths on the start line. North Point Ferry Pier. So I'm not going to go through that again. I have no idea what happens to the tide. I even wrote it down. Look at that. The water's not out of the tide unless you're touching it. We've done that. So I'm going to skip past that bit. Someone must know the tide times every race. If someone on your boat doesn't know what time the tide turns and whether it's double high or it's turning and doing the other way, you have very little chance of winning the race. So either take responsibility yourself or say to someone on the boat, your job is to turn up with the tide time. You have to have that piece of information. Okay.